Okay, hello everyone, and today we are going to be learning about the Americans getting involved in the war in Vietnam in the 1960s. So the Vietnam War was a very significant war for the development of the Cold War. And you can see from these pictures here that show you a couple of pictures of American soldiers involved in the war in Vietnam, that this was a very, very difficult and very challenging war for the Americans to be fighting in, and also a deeply controversial war, which drew lots and lots of protests across America towards the end of the 1960s. So we're going to find out what the war was all about and do some work about the significance of the Vietnam War. So this is what we're going to be learning about within this online learning lesson today, and we're going to go through these various steps within our lesson. So these are the different American presidents after World War II, and I thought it's just significant for you to have a look at who they were. So Harry Truman, Dwight D. Eisenhower, John F. Kennedy, Lyndon Johnson, and then Richard Nixon. Now, Lyndon Johnson was the one that was the president of America, as that America, what we call, escalated their involvement in the Vietnam War and got more and more involved within the Vietnam War during this time. So he's a particularly significant person for us to be aware of. So where is Vietnam? Well, Vietnam is a country in Southeast Asia, and this is significant. It's quite far away from the United States of America. It was controlled by the French up until 1954, and then the country was divided between North Vietnam, which was supported by the communists, by the Soviet Union, and South Vietnam, which was supported by the Americans. And that's how a war developed within Vietnam during this time, and that's why it links in with the Cold War. So this shows you a map of Vietnam. The capital of North Vietnam, which became communist, was Hanoi, which you can see up here, and the capital of South Vietnam is Saigon, which you can see down here. And you can see where it is in terms of Southeast Asia. Other countries nearby, places like Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and then China is up here in the north. So the geography of Vietnam, one of the distinctive features of the Vietnam War is it was a particularly challenging country to fight in. In terms of the terrain, lots and lots of mountains, lots and lots of tropical rainforests, paddy fields, deltas. There were towns and cities as well, and then there was the bush as well. So a very, very challenging country to actually fight a war in, and the geography of Vietnam had a significant impact on the military conflict within the Vietnam War. So Vietnam, as I said, had been a colony of France, but the people in Vietnam had fought for their independence, and the independence fighters were led by this man who was called Ho Chi Minh. And what happened is the French forces were defeated and Vietnam was divided along what was known as the 17th parallel, and divided between North Vietnam and South Vietnam. And again, you can see the geography around it. Now, America was worried about communism in North Vietnam because they believed in an idea called the Domino Theory. They believed that if one country became communist, then it would encourage other countries to become communist as well. And therefore, just like a stack of dominoes, they would all fall down and those other countries would all become communist. So they wanted to stop the spread of communism. So they were concerned about the development of communism in North Vietnam because of this whole domino theory. So the Vietnam War, there was a state of civil war basically between North and South Vietnam, North being communist, South being capitalist. So what the Americans did is they began under really the time of President Kennedy to send advisors and equipment, money and weapons to help the South defeat the North. But as you can see here from this this graph, the blue shows the amount of US soldiers and advisors in Vietnam. From about 1964, the number of American forces in Vietnam grew absolutely massively. So there was over 500,000 in Vietnam towards the end of the 1960s, and you can see here lots and lots of American soldiers were killed as a result of the Vietnam War as well. So it was a very, very significant moment in American history. Now, one of the key events which caused the Americans to what we call escalate their involvement was an incident which is known as the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which took place in 1964. And in this incident, North Vietnamese torpedo boats allegedly attacked the US Navy in a place called the Gulf of Tonkin, which you can see is here on the map. And this American Navy ship was involved in that. And that led to an escalation in the American involvement. And President Johnson, who you can see pictured here, he decided to order a wide-scale bombing campaign of North Vietnam. And he also gave permission for US combat troops, US soldiers, to actually go into battle on the ground in Vietnam. Now, this was known as Operation Rolling Thunder. So this is what Johnson said in 1964. If we quit Vietnam, tomorrow we'll be fighting in Hawaii, and next week we'll have to fight in San Francisco. So what he means is that if they don't get involved in Vietnam, then communism's going to spread further and further, believed in that so-called domino theory, and therefore you had to fight against communism in Vietnam. So what Johnson's saying here is that fighting in Vietnam is about defending America, really, from the development of communism. So the forces of North Vietnam were known as the Vietcong, or the VC, and they used tactics in war which is known as guerrilla warfare. Now, guerrilla is a Spanish word which means little war. So the tactics of the North Vietnamese forces was to use these guerrilla tactics such as ambush, sabotage, laying traps, for example, what are called small arms attacks, hit and run attacks, where maybe soldiers would go up and attack say a group of American soldiers and then attack them really quickly and then run off. The North Vietnamese knew that they couldn't defeat the Americans conventionally. The Americans will always have more weapons and equipment, but they could do them a lot of damage, and if so, that might turn public opinion in America against the war and enable the Vietcong to win the war. So that's what the tactics were all about, and you can see here these are some of the main tactics of guerrilla warfare. These are some of the things that took place. So there was things like ambushing enemy vehicles. Now, one of the things I talked about before was the geography of Vietnam. So these forces were able, the Vietcong forces were able to hide out in places like the jungle and the tropical rainforest, for example. They knew the terrain really well. They knew lots of secret trails like the Ho Chi Minh Trail, for example, so they could travel easily between north and south without being discovered. They could plant mines and booby traps, for example, and these tactics were very effective against the American soldiers. And you can see here that this gives you a visual image of the fact that the Vietcong forces were able to hide out and go undetected from the American soldiers that were trying to attack them. This shows you as well one of the tunnel complexes. So the Vietcong had these amazing tunnel complexes which they built with secret trapdoors, for example, and they had all sorts of things in there, and if they got detected, they had ways of setting off explosives so that their tunnels couldn't be taken over. They even had things like a tunnel hospital for the seriously wounded. So it was amazingly complex, some of the things that they were able to do. They had, it's estimated, they had about 240 kilometers network of underground tunnels in the Vietnam War. And again, you can see there an example of one of these tunnels, wells for drinking water and firing posts. They had lots of little traps in there. So this is what's called a stake trap. So if an American soldier was unlucky enough to step on that, they would fall through and get spiked on these stakes. And you can see here some of the different traps that they had. So this was a spike trap pit, and you can see there that they would cover the ground loosely, but if you actually put any weight on that, you would fall through. So they had lots of different things. You can see that some of the different traps there. They had things like trip wires that set off grenades. They had mines. So you can get the impression about just how dangerous some of the fighting in the Vietnam War actually was. And again, you can see some of the traps that were made there as well. So very difficult for the American soldiers. Now, the average age of the American soldiers in the Vietnam War was only 19. So many of these combat soldiers for the Americans are very inexperienced, very young. They would not get much of a break from fighting in the war as well. They could never fully feel safe. So it was a really not a pleasant conflict. And we saw that picture at the start of the American soldier with the words "War is hell" on his helmet, and it really was for many of these American soldiers fighting in the Vietnam War. So the Vietcong tactics were actually pretty successful militarily. Nearly 50,000 American soldiers were actually killed during the Vietnam War. many more Vietnamese people were killed actually in the war than that, and it was a hugely tragic and horrific event in history. The Americans responded with tactics where they used their sort of superior firepower that they had. So they used things like what were called Zippo raids, which is named after a popular brand of lighter, where they would often burn villages, for example. And this meant that the Americans weren't able to win what's called the hearts and minds of the local people, because unfortunately many innocent civilians died. There was a horrible event in the Vietnam War called the My Lai Massacre, where American soldiers were responsible for the killing of lots of innocent people in a village called My Lai. Operation Rolling Thunder was obviously used. The Americans also used chemical weapons like Agent Orange, for example, which was used to destroy farmland and crops and things like that to, again, try and have a military impact. They also used this very deadly weapon called napalm, which caused huge explosions and fire, and that, again, was seen as a very controversial weapon. Okay, so what you're going to do based on this this work from this lesson is you're going to have a go at answering these questions. So I want you to answer the questions: why did the Americans get involved in the Vietnam War? So just give me a few bullet points. You can make a little mind map for that. And then number two, make a mind map or notes to answer the following: how did the Vietcong fight the Americans in the Vietnam War? How did the Americans fight the Vietcong? And then why do you think the USA were unable to defeat the Vietcong? So answer those questions on the Word document, and then you can hand that in via assignments. Thank you very much. Bye bye.